Good morning. It's good to have you here. Today's Daily 15 is titled Wittgenstein on Knowing and Doubting. It comes from a book called Major Works of Ludwig Wittgenstein, which contains a number of his works ranging from his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, his Blue and Brown books, and a work he wrote later in life titled On Certainty. And that's where our excerpt comes from today, sections 92 through 94. In it, Wittgenstein explores the difference between normal, everyday beliefs. The bus is going to get here at 2:30 p.m. And beliefs that serve, in one way or another, as backdrops for us. Backdrops for how we look at the world and for how we ask questions and for how we embark upon investigations and evaluate evidence and seem quite obvious. For instance, the world has existed for a long time. Or I might say, as I lift my hand up in front of my face, look, there's a hand. Those are the sort of beliefs that he's interested in. Before we get started, I just have to remind you, if you'd like to read along, head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. There you can purchase the book and read the rest of Wittgenstein for yourself, or you can just look at the text of the paragraph. Again, alifeofthought.com/D15. And if you'd like to join the conversation, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. Wittgenstein is hard. He's hard to understand. And again, especially here, my words and my interpretations are not meant to be the final ones. They're meant to be the first ones. So if you have any disagreements, points of contention, please share them. Anyhow, we can go ahead and get started with paragraph 1. Wittgenstein says, however, we can ask, may someone have telling grounds for believing that the earth has existed only for a short time, say since his own birth? Suppose he had always been told that. Would he have any good reason to doubt it? Men have believed that they could make rain. Why should not a king be brought up in the belief that the world began with him? And if More and this king were to meet and discuss, could More really prove his belief to be the right one? I do not say that More could not convert the king to his view, but it would be a conversion of a special kind. The king would be brought to look at the world in a different way. Remember that one is sometimes convinced of the correctness of a view by its simplicity or symmetry, i.e., these are what induce one to go over to this point of view. One then simply says something like, that's how it must be. Okay, let's get started with our highlighted phrase. And that, in this case, it's just a name, More. To understand what's happening in this paragraph, it's absolutely crucial to recognize that it isn't a stand-alone paragraph. This work of Wittgenstein's On Certainty, is written within the context, or perhaps the shadow, of a work by a British philosopher by the name of G.E. Moore. The necessary background is as follows. Moore is interested in contending with, and I'm going to borrow the language of Christine Korsgaard, the philosopher's bugbear, a skeptic. You might have encountered the skeptic before. Of course, we're going to want to distinguish between different kinds of skepticism. There is, of course, the healthy skepticism that we're all familiar with. If I began selling supplements on this page, I hope you would all be skeptical in that kind of way. And as is common nowadays in philosophical conversations, there is skepticism about the existence of things. Is morality objective? Do moral facts exist? We think of these skeptics as moral skeptics. They doubt or are skeptical of a specific domain in philosophy. Someone might also be skeptical about beauty or maybe even time. People have weird beliefs. Nevertheless, We're going to want to distinguish all of this from a different kind of skepticism, what philosophers might call epistemological skepticism, or just radical skepticism. These sorts of skeptics wonder whether we can ever really know anything. That's what that first word means, epistemological, as relating to knowledge. Now, okay, I can feel it. You're incredulous. Of course we can know things. But as these skeptics will be quick to remind us, we're very often wrong. Famously, Descartes claimed that we have no way to be sure that we're not dreaming. And so while we may think that we know various truths, that this keyboard is below me, my keys are in the bowl by the door, my cat is on the mat, in fact, we may be dreaming, and all of these things may just be false. We might be brains in a vat, living in a simulated reality. And the skeptic, in its most basic form, takes this possibility of incorrectness, or maybe conversely, the impossibility of certainty, to ward off the possibility of knowledge. More's response to this is to note that there are some things I do know, some things I seem to have a level of certainty of. That the world existed long before me is an example of this. And so that is the view Wittgenstein is responding to. And so he's going to want to put some pressure on More, but he's also going to want to put some pressure on the skeptic. Specifically, the idea that the only thing that could supply us with knowledge is certainty, in which all doubt, all possibility of doubt, is excluded. Eventually, and this is where we're going to end up, I'm giving you a little preview. Wittgenstein's point is going to be that if we exclude the possibility of doubt, there's sort of nothing for us to know. We also exclude the possibility of knowledge. But don't worry, we'll get there soon enough. The place to start, however, is our underlined phrase. Wittgenstein discusses the king's conversion to More's way of thinking as a conversion of a special kind. What's going on here? Wittgenstein's point is subtle, but it's deeply, 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 deeply important. It's that if More were to convince this king, he would not be doing what we normally think of as proving or disagreeing. Normally, a disagreement over some fact goes something like this. I believe that the bus is going to come at 2 p.m., and you are sure that it's going to come at 2:30. We decide on some mutually acceptable piece of evidence, i.e., what does the bus tracking app say? And then we look. One of us is shown to be right, and one of us is shown to be wrong. Of course, being convinced doesn't always imply the presence of a test. I may, for instance, be convinced that an act is wrong, that I did the wrong thing when I failed to donate money to that charity. Now, me being convinced of this, my being shown to be wrong, does not require that the person I'm arguing with and I agree on some way of verifying that my donating to the charity was wrong. Rather, the way it would actually most likely happen would be they draw my attention to certain considerations that when I was deciding not to donate, I failed to consider. Maybe they ask me whether or not I would save a child who is drowning in a pond. And I say, of course I would do that. And then they say, well, how is this any different? There's no test there. They've sort of just drawn my attention to considerations that I wasn't thinking about in the first place. Now, we may first think that what is going on between More and the king when they disagree about when the earth came into existence is analogous to this. But a big piece of Wittgenstein's thought here is that it is not. And this is crucial because part of Wittgenstein's project is to put pressure on a temptation that we may feel here. Specifically, we may find ourselves tempted to understand the king and More's conversation on the model of a normal, everyday disagreement about a moral question or perhaps about when the bus will arrive. And according to such a model, we imagine that one of them knows something or they have something, this knowledge, that the other doesn't. And further, that they know it in precisely the same way as we might know when the bus is coming. But it is this confusion that Wittgenstein wishes to dissuade us of. It is not, this is his point, I think, it's not that one of them knows something the other does not. And once we come to appreciate this, Wittgenstein thinks, we're actually going to feel the pull of skepticism much less. Let's see why. And to see why, we're going to move over to our circled phrase. The last annotation that we're going to take a look at is our circled one. At the end of our paragraph, Wittgenstein says, after the king, his mind has been changed, Wittgenstein says, one then simply says something like, that's how it must be. Now, Wittgenstein's point here is that if More were to convince this king, he would not do so by giving him normal reasons, but instead by offering an alternative picture of the world, offering him an alternative picture of the world, one that is so simple that the king's initial way of thinking, his supposition that the world began with him, now strikes the king as ludicrous. And okay, what will it look like for the king to change his mind here? His old view will suddenly become entirely implausible to him, and he will look upon the new truth that the world existed for a long time prior to his birth as the only sensible and reasonable thing to believe. He'll suddenly lose the ability to imagine that the world began with him, and all of the beliefs or investigations that sprung from his initial mistaken view will suddenly lose their shimmer. And so there's a sense in which doubt is excluded, or perhaps less welcome in a case such as the king's, when compared to one in which I'm shown to be incorrect or mistaken on the basis of reasons. Namely, to be convinced one way or another that the earth existed before one's birth is in part to not be able to imagine or to cease to be able to imagine one's initial view. You lose the ability to imagine that the world existed, the world did not exist before one's birth. So doubting these kinds of beliefs is excluded. Now, in order to draw out the relevance of this, let's look back to the case of the bus. Both my friend and I can imagine what it would be for the bus to arrive at 2 or arrive at 2:30. And so doubt is possible here. We can both imagine our belief being wrong, and that's why we embark upon an investigation of it in the first place. And the fact of this doubt being possible is what makes our eventual conclusion so much of an achievement. We've sort of overcome the possibility of being wrong, and we have a real thing that we can stake ourselves on. But this is where we get some characteristically Wittgensteinian moves. Namely, Wittgenstein is going to want to ask if, in the case of the king, doubt is excluded. Wittgenstein's going to ask, well, okay, in what sense does the king, or More in that case, know something at all here? If doubting is not open to them, if it's characteristic of both of their beliefs, either that the world did not exist before their birth or after it, that they have no ability to imagine an alternative, and instead, the only way they could change their view is being sort of converted in this special way that we discussed, Wittgenstein's going to be skeptical of whether the thing they have could be called knowledge in the first place. And so this brings us to a sort of general Wittgensteinian principle here, namely the idea that if a certain belief is not open to being doubted, then neither is it a candidate for knowledge. If you can't doubt something, if certainty is guaranteed, if you can't imagine what it would be like for something to be untrue, well, you don't know that thing either if there's nothing it would be like for it to be false. And so we're left with a sort of reversal of the skeptic's view. Recall, after all, that we began imagining a skeptic who moved from the possibility of doubt to the impossibility of knowledge. But it seems then that Wittgenstein is offering a picture that is exactly the opposite. The only things that we can know are things that we can doubt. I can know that the bus is coming at 2, or I can know that it's coming at 2:30, just in case there's something it would be for me to be wrong about it. Otherwise, the knowledge doesn't amount to anything. There's no achievement in knowing something that you can't but believe. And so, tempted though we may be to talk about knowledge here, to imagine that we know the world existed long before us, this is a confusion. We ought to forego talk of knowledge, says Wittgenstein, where there is no possibility, where there is no logical room for doubt. That's it for the first paragraph. Was there something I said you disagreed with? Something you think I missed? Remember, this is my first time reading this too. So if you have something to contribute, a disagreement or a point that you think needs to be emphasized more, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. Share your ideas and discuss them with others. But with that being said, we're going to head on over to the following paragraph. Actually, the following two. And if you'd like to mark them up yourself, head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. Wonderful. Paragraph 2. The propositions presenting what More knows are all of such a kind that it is difficult to imagine why anyone should believe the contrary, e.g., the proposition that More has spent his whole life in close proximity to the earth. Once more, I can speak of myself here instead of speaking of More. What could induce me to believe the opposite? Either a memory or having been told. Everything that I have seen or heard gives me the conviction that no man has ever been far from the earth. Nothing in my picture of the world speaks in favor of the opposite. But I did not get my picture of the world by satisfying myself of its correctness. That's a crucial sentence. Nor do I have it because I am satisfied of its correctness. No, it is the inherited background against which I distinguish between true and false. And I'm not going to say too much here, so you can think about it for yourself. But look at the difference between the sense in which I know the bus is going to come at 2:30 and my picture of the world, which I do not have, or it's not the case that I have it because I am satisfied by its correctness. That's what I'll leave you with. See you next time.